Hello, I'm SA, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin. A bold memorandum, circulated among a handful of colleagues in the summer of 1949, proposed a solution to one of the modern world's most intractable problems. Its author, Warren Weaver, a mathematician and scientific administrator of formidable influence, titled his paper with a simple, elegant, and profoundly ambitious name, Translations. The document itself was a masterpiece of intellectual provocation. It laid forth an idea so audacious, so counterintuitive, that it effectively created an entire field of inquiry from the sheer force of its central metaphor. In the shadow of a global war and at the dawn of a cold one, with channels of communication between superpowers becoming both more critical and more opaque, Weaver suggested that the ancient art of translation was ready for a radical reinvention. He proposed we think of it as a problem of cryptography. The world that received Weaver's paper was one struggling with an unprecedented deluge of information. The scientific and technical output of the Second World War had been immense, and the pace of discovery was accelerating. For American and British researchers, a vast and vital body of work, particularly from the Soviet Union, was accumulating behind the formidable barrier of the Russian language. Intelligence agencies faced a similar crisis, sifting through mountains of foreign documents and communications, their efforts bottlenecked by the finite number of human experts capable of rendering these texts into English. The translator, a figure of immense cultural and intellectual skill, was an artisan in an age demanding industrial production. The challenge was one of scale, a problem of processing capacity that human cognition alone seemed unable to meet. The existing paradigm treated translation as a deeply humanistic endeavor, a delicate transfer of meaning, nuance, and cultural context that required years of linguistic immersion and a poet's sensitivity. Weaver's genius was to sidestep this entire framework. His proposal, articulated with compelling clarity, reframed the whole enterprise. Consider his own words. When I look at an article in Russian, I say, this is really written in English, but it has been coded in some strange symbols. I will now proceed to decode. This single conceptual leap was revolutionary. It took the messy, subjective, and frustratingly complex problem of language and placed it squarely in the domain of mathematics, statistics, and engineering. The recent triumphs of the war provided the perfect intellectual backdrop. Allied cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park and elsewhere had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated enemy hypnotexts could be broken through systematic mathematical attack. They had built machines, the predecessors of the modern computer, to reveal the hidden order within seemingly random streams of characters. Weaver's analogy suggested that a foreign language was another form of ciphertext. The underlying message, the plain text, was there, waiting to be recovered through algorithmic means. This cryptographic perspective immediately made the problem appear tractable for a machine. It transformed translation from an art of interpretation into a science of decryption. The idea was powered by the nascent principles of information theory, a field his close collaborator Claude Shannon was then formalizing. Shannon's work described communication as a probabilistic process, subject to noise and redundancy. Weaver, with astonishing foresight, saw that language itself fit this model perfectly. A language possesses deep statistical regularities. Certain letters and letter combinations appear with predictable frequencies. Words follow grammatical patterns. Idioms and phrases exhibit statistical correlations. These patterns, Weaver argued, were the key to the code. They provided the leverage a machine could use to systematically dismantle the linguistic encryption and reveal the English message concealed within. He was acutely aware of the central difficulty: ambiguity. The same word in one language can map to many different words in another, its meaning entirely dependent on the surrounding context. The English word fast, for instance, carries wildly different implications in the phrases running fast versus standing fast versus observing a fast. A simple word-for-word substitution would produce gibberish. Weaver's solution to this problem of polysemy was remarkably prescient. He proposed what he called a window of context. A machine, when encountering an ambiguous word, would examine its immediate neighbors, the 2 or 3 words preceding it, and the 2 or 3 words following it. The statistical properties of this local neighborhood, this small window of text, would provide the necessary clues to resolve the ambiguity. This concept of a contextual window is a direct intellectual ancestor of the N-gram models that would dominate computational linguistics for half a century, and remains a foundational principle, albeit in a far more sophisticated form, in the machine learning systems of today. Weaver even speculated about a deeper universal structure underlying all human languages. Perhaps, he mused, the process of translation could involve decoding the source text into a kind of intermediate language-independent logical representation, a universal symbolic language, before re-encoding it into the target language. This hinted at a quest for the fundamental, shared architecture of human thought, a goal that would animate linguistics and cognitive science for decades to come. His memorandum was a blueprint, a call to arms for mathematicians, engineers and linguists to unite their efforts on this grand challenge. The effect was immediate and profound. The memorandum electrified the research community, securing funding and inspiring a generation of pioneers to build the first machine translation systems. The Georgetown IBM experiment of 1954, which automatically translated over 60 Russian sentences into English, was a direct result of the intellectual climate Weaver had created. While the initial optimism of the era would eventually collide with the immense complexity of the task, leading to a period of disillusionment, the seed Weaver planted had taken root. His core idea that language could be treated as a statistical code endured. Looking back from our contemporary vantage point, surrounded by technologies that offer instantaneous translation on our phones and computers, Weaver's 1949 memorandum appears as something more than a historical curiosity. It is a foundational document. The statistical machine translation systems that rose to prominence in the late 20th century were the direct descendants of his cryptographic analogy, relying on vast bilingual text corpora to learn the probabilistic mappings between languages. Today's neural machine translation, powered by deep learning and large language models, represents the ultimate fulfillment of his vision. These systems operate as immense statistical engines, identifying and manipulating patterns in language on a scale Weaver could have scarcely imagined. Their ability to handle context, nuance, and style emerges from analyzing billions of sentences, effectively expanding his window of context to encompass a massive portion of all human-generated text. The process is one of decoding and re-encoding, a sophisticated cryptographic exercise performed on the very fabric of meaning. The mind capable of such a conceptual leap, of seeing a cryptographic puzzle in a line of Russian poetry, was one that thrived on synthesis. Weaver possessed a rare ability to perceive the deep connections between seemingly disparate domains of human knowledge. He saw the world as a set of complex, interconnected problems, each demanding a new kind of organized, interdisciplinary attack. This perspective, which allowed him to reimagine the ancient art of translation, would soon be turned toward an even more fundamental code. His next great intellectual campaign would involve shifting his focus from the languages of human cultures to the universal language of life itself. This intellectual posture, one that saw deep structure and solvable codes within the world's complexities, found its ultimate arena in 1932. Assuming the directorship of the Natural Sciences Division at the Rockefeller Foundation, Weaver was handed the reins of one of the planet's most powerful philanthropic engines. The institution he inherited possessed a venerable history of monumental public health achievements, waging successful campaigns against scourges like yellow fever and hookworm. Its funding philosophy was pragmatic, targeted, and firmly rooted in the established disciplines of medicine and classical biology. The prevailing approach addressed the visible symptoms of human suffering and the macroscopic classification of life. The fundamental chemical and physical processes that governed heredity, growth, and disease remained largely in a shadowy, underfunded domain, a collection of disparate questions pursued by isolated chemists, physicists, and geneticists. The very machinery of life was a black box. Weaver arrived with a startlingly different map of the scientific frontier. With the clear-eyed perspective of a mathematician, he surveyed the landscape of biology and perceived an opportunity for a profound reorientation. He envisioned a new science, one that would dissolve the traditional boundaries between disciplines. It would deploy the powerful analytical tools of the physical sciences, the rigor of quantum mechanics, the precision of X-ray crystallography, the quantitative force of statistical analysis, to dismantle the most basic questions of biological existence. What is a gene, in physical terms? How does a protein fold into its functional shape? By what chemical mechanisms do living organisms replicate themselves with such fidelity? To give this audacious hybrid enterprise a name and a unifying identity, he christened it molecular biology. This act of naming was itself an act of creation, providing a conceptual banner under which a new kind of scientific army could assemble. His strategy was as elegant as it was revolutionary. He began the painstaking work of pivoting the Rockefeller Foundation's immense financial power away from its traditional channels. This was a redirection of resources, and more importantly, a redirection of scientific philosophy. He became a patron of intellectual cross-pollination. He actively sought out brilliant minds in physics and chemistry who were growing curious about the messy, vibrant world of biology. He provided them with the resources, stability, and encouragement to apply their expertise to the molecules of life. His work was that of a master strategist, identifying key laboratories and visionary individuals who could become the foundational pillars of this new edifice. The California Institute of Technology, under the leadership of the formidable chemist Linus Pauling, became a principal beneficiary and a model for Weaver's program. Rockefeller funding poured into Caltech, supporting Pauling's groundbreaking work on the nature of the chemical bond, research that would later prove indispensable to understanding the structure of proteins and nucleic acids. Weaver's grants enabled the construction and refinement of essential new instruments, like the ultracentrifuge developed by Theodore Savedberg, which allowed for the separation and characterization of massive biological molecules. He saw that progress required a new generation of tools, capable of seeing and manipulating the invisible world within the cell. His influence extended across the Atlantic. He cultivated a deep and fruitful relationship with the community of researchers in Great Britain, particularly at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. The grants he administered supported the work of Sir William Lawrence Bragg's group in X-ray crystallography, a technique that was moving from the analysis of simple mineral crystals to the far more challenging task of deciphering the structures of complex proteins. This sustained long-term investment created the fertile intellectual and technological environment from which the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA would eventually spring. While the final breakthrough by Watson and Crick received funding from other sources, its conceptual and technical lineage traces directly back to the ecosystem Weaver had so meticulously constructed over 2 decades. He was the architect of the cathedral, even if he did not lay the final stone. Further evidence of his strategic genius lies in his support for George Beadle and Edward Tatum. Their work on the bread mold, Neurospora crassa, funded by the Foundation, led to the seminal one gene, one enzyme hypothesis. This concept provided a clear functional link between the abstract unit of heredity, the gene, and a concrete biochemical entity, the protein. It was a cornerstone of molecular genetics, transforming the gene from a statistical concept into a physical agent with a specific testable function. Weaver's genius was in recognizing that such fundamental insights, while seemingly distant from immediate clinical application, represented the most powerful path toward a true understanding of health and disease. His role was a new paradigm of scientific administration. He operated as a meta-scientist, orchestrating a complex multi-decade research program across continents and disciplines. He was a talent scout, a strategist, and an intellectual catalyst. He understood that building a new science required more than money. It required a coherent vision, a shared vocabulary, and the deliberate creation of an interdisciplinary community. The success of this grand project, the systematic construction of molecular biology from a loose collection of ideas into the dominant force in life sciences, offered a profound lesson. It was a real-world demonstration of managing a system of immense, interconnected complexity. This experience, orchestrating a scientific revolution, was shaping his understanding of the very nature of modern problems, a theme that would soon become the central focus of his most influential philosophical work. The culmination of this thinking arrived in 1948, published with characteristic modesty within the annual report of the Rockefeller Foundation. The essay, titled Science and Complexity, represented a profound intellectual stocktaking, a moment when a chief architect of mid-century science paused to survey the landscape he had helped to shape and to chart the territory that remained unconquered. This document, born from the practical experience of orchestrating research on a global scale, offered a philosophical framework that would resonate for decades. It was a cartography of the known and the unknown, and it provided a name for the vast, challenging continent that science was only beginning to explore. Weaver began his analysis by classifying the history of scientific inquiry into 3 distinct epochs, each defined by the type of problem it had successfully mastered. The first era, stretching from the 17th century through the 19th, was the age of problems of simplicity. These were the grand clockwork challenges that yielded to the new tools of calculus and mechanics. Think of the trajectory of a cannonball, the orbit of a planet, the swing of a pendulum, or the forces acting on a lever. Such problems are characterized by a very small number of variables, perhaps 2, 3, or 4, whose relationships are governed by elegant, deterministic laws. The genius of figures like Newton and Laplace was their ability to isolate these core variables from the noisy background of reality and formulate precise, predictive equations. The entire edifice of classical physics was built upon this extraordinary power to solve problems of simplicity. Following this came a second great conquest, which Weaver termed problems of disorganized complexity. These challenges occupied the opposite end of the spectrum. Here, the number of variables is astronomical, running into the billions or trillions. Consider the behavior of a gas in a container. To track the position and velocity of every single molecule would be an impossible task, a problem of simplicity scaled to absurdity. The breakthrough, achieved by Maxwell, Boltzmann, and Gibbs, was the realization that one could forego knowledge of the individual parts. Because the molecules moved randomly and independently, their collective behavior was beautifully predictable through the laws of probability and statistical mechanics. The system, in its immense disorganization, exhibited a stable, average behavior. This same statistical logic allowed insurance companies to build profitable enterprises by predicting human mortality rates without knowing the fate of any single individual, and it enabled telephone engineers to design switching systems to handle a chaotic flood of independent calls. Science, through statistics, had mastered the mob. Having delineated these two conquered territories, Weaver turned his attention to the vast shadowy region that lay between them. This was the domain of organized complexity, and he identified it as the next great frontier of science, perhaps its ultimate one. These are problems that feature a moderate number of components, far too many for the classical equations of simplicity, yet too few and too interconnected for the averaging techniques of statistics. The defining characteristic of these systems is the intricate, non-random, and non-linear web of relationships that binds the components together. The parts interact with one another in a structured, organized way, creating emergent behaviors that belong to the system as a whole. The word organized was the crucial insight. The interactions themselves were the essence of the problem. Weaver's examples were telling and prescient, drawn from the very heart of the life and social sciences. What determines the folding of a protein into its unique functional three-dimensional shape? What constellation of genetic, environmental, and cellular factors leads to the development of cancer? What is the physical and chemical basis of memory in the human brain? How do genes orchestrate the complex, timed development of an organism from a single cell? What web of production, consumption, and human psychology determines the price of wheat? These questions were impervious to the established tools of science. One could analyze a single neuron with exquisite precision, a problem of simplicity. One could describe the statistical properties of a whole population, a problem of disorganized complexity. But to understand the organized network of a few thousand neurons that gives rise to a single thought, or the coordinated expression of a few hundred genes that builds an eye, was to face the terra incognita of organized complexity. This diagnosis was a powerful act of intellectual clarification. It explained why the biological and social sciences had lagged behind physics in their predictive power. Their fundamental subject matter resided in this difficult middle kingdom. The paper, however, did more than identify a challenge. It proposed a path forward, a strategy born directly from Weaver's experience at the helm of the Rockefeller Foundation. He foresaw with remarkable clarity the tools that would be necessary to explore this new continent. First, he pointed to the nascent technology of the electronic computer. He understood that these machines, then room-sized behemoths of vacuum tubes and relays, represented a new kind of scientific instrument. Their power was the ability to perform vast numbers of calculations, making it possible to simulate the behavior of these moderately numerous, highly interactive systems. One could build a model of an economy, a cell, or a neural circuit, and watch it evolve, step by step, in ways that analytical equations could ever capture. The computer was the microscope for organized complexity. Second, he championed the power of the interdisciplinary team. The very nature of organized complexity meant that its problems refused to respect the tidy boundaries of academic departments. Understanding a living organism required the insights of physics, the tools of chemistry, the logic of mathematics, and the deep knowledge of biology, all working in concert. This was the very model he had used to build molecular biology, bringing physicists like Max Delbrück to study bacteriophages and chemists like Linus Pauling to study the chemical bond. He was codifying his own successful administrative strategy into a universal principle for future scientific progress. The lone genius in the attic was an insufficient model for tackling the great systems problems of the modern world. Science required organized, collaborative effort. The enduring influence of this 1948 essay is difficult to overstate. Weaver provided the vocabulary and the conceptual framework for what would become the defining scientific movements of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The entire field of systems biology is a direct assault on the problems of organized complexity he described. Network science, which maps the interconnectedness of everything from social groups to metabolic pathways, is its direct intellectual descendant. Fields like chaos theory and computational neuroscience are dedicated to understanding the intricate emergent dynamics of these very systems. Weaver's paper reads today as a founding document for the age of systems thinking, a clear-eyed prophecy of the shift from a purely reductionist view of the world to one that embraces the holistic, integrated nature of reality's most fascinating and urgent questions. While he was articulating this grand vision for the future of all science, he was simultaneously engaged in another, more focused act of intellectual translation, one that would provide a new and powerful language for the very concept of information itself. That very act of intellectual translation found its most celebrated expression through his engagement with the work of Claude Shannon. At Bell Labs, Shannon had produced a 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, a document of such austere and concentrated genius that it remains a cornerstone of the digital age. Shannon's theory was a triumph of abstraction, defining a universal unit of information, the bit, and providing a rigorous mathematical framework for quantifying its transmission through a noisy channel. He gave engineers the tools to calculate channel capacity, to understand redundancy, and to design codes that could approach the theoretical limits of perfect communication. The work was revolutionary, but its revolution was, initially, a quiet one, confined to the specialized realms of electrical engineering and cryptography. The equations spoke of signal-to-noise ratios and stochastic processes, their immediate application aimed at improving the fidelity of telephone calls and telegraph messages. The profound philosophical implications, the sense that Shannon had perhaps discovered a fundamental currency of the cosmos, remained latent within the dense formalism. The challenge was one of scope and language. How could this powerful new concept of information, born from engineering problems, be liberated to address questions of meaning, biology, and human society? This is the intellectual space Warren Weaver entered, transforming a specialized monograph into a cultural and scientific touchstone. When their work was published together as a book in 1949, it was Weaver's introductory essay, titled Recent Contributions to the Mathematical Theory of Communication, that served as the great bridge. His contribution was an act of profound conceptual clarification, a framing that made Shannon's mathematics accessible and, more important, universally relevant. Weaver accomplished this by articulating a brilliant three-tiered model of the communication problem. He began at what he called Level A, the technical problem. This was Shannon's home ground. How accurately can the symbols of communication be transmitted? This level is concerned with the engineering of the channel itself. The question here is purely syntactic. It cares little for what the bits represent. Its sole focus is on whether the sequence of ones and zeros that arrives at the destination is identical to the sequence that was sent. The enemy is noise, entropy, the physical degradation of the signal. Shannon's mathematics provided the weapons for this fight, a beautiful and complete theory for achieving technical fidelity. Weaver then ascended to a second, more interpretive plane, which he named Level B, the semantic problem. The question here becomes, how precisely do the transmitted symbols convey the desired meaning? Here, we leave the clean domain of bits and enter the messy, wonderful world of human language and interpretation. A message can be transmitted with perfect technical accuracy. Every letter, every space, every punctuation mark received exactly as sent, and yet fail completely at this level. The sentence "the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak," when translated by an early naive computer program into Russian and back into English, famously returned as "the vodka is good, but the meat is rotten." The transmission at level A was flawless. The failure at level B was catastrophic. Weaver recognized that most human communication operates with a thick layer of shared context, cultural understanding, and implicit knowledge. Shannon's theory offered a way to measure the information content of the symbols, but Weaver's framework highlighted the immense challenge of ensuring that the information about meaning was also successfully conveyed. This distinction opened a conceptual door for linguists, philosophers, and cognitive scientists to begin using the tools of information theory to explore ambiguity, context, and the very nature of understanding. Finally, Weaver posited a third and most encompassing challenge, what he termed Level C, the effectiveness problem. This is the pragmatic apex of communication. How effectively does the received meaning affect conduct in the desired way? A message can be transmitted with perfect accuracy, Level A, and be understood with perfect clarity, Level B, yet still fail to achieve its ultimate purpose. A logician's elegant proof might be perfectly understood by a hostile audience, yet fail to persuade them. A doctor's clear warning about the dangers of smoking might be fully comprehended by a patient who continues the habit. This level implicates psychology, sociology, rhetoric, and economics. It is the realm of persuasion, motivation, and behavioral change. By articulating this third level, Weaver performed his most audacious act of intellectual expansion. He took a theory designed for optimizing telephone networks and positioned it as a foundational framework for understanding all human interaction. He gave social scientists a new vocabulary and a new set of questions, inviting them to think about social cohesion, political campaigns, and economic behavior as complex communication problems. This three-level architecture was Weaver's unique and enduring contribution to information theory. It was an act of magnificent intellectual catalysis. He made Shannon's ideas portable, transforming them from a specialized engineering tool into a universal paradigm. The book they co-authored became a bestseller, its influence spreading like a dye through the intellectual waters of the mid-20th century, coloring disciplines far from its origin. It was this ability to see the larger pattern, to frame the specific discovery within a grander philosophical context, that defined Weaver's singular genius. This pattern of thought, this instinct for intellectual architecture, is the unifying thread running through his entire career. He was a scientist of the second order, a meta-scientist whose primary object of study was science itself. His work on machine translation was an effort to frame human language as a solvable problem of statistical decoding. His stewardship of the Rockefeller Foundation's biology program was a strategic campaign to frame the fundamental questions of life in the language of physics and chemistry, creating the very field of molecular biology. His seminal paper on organized complexity was a grand act of cartography, drawing the boundaries of a new continent of scientific inquiry that lay between the simple and the chaotic. And his collaboration with Shannon was the framing of information as the universal currency of knowledge, from the bit to the brain to the body politic. Warren Weaver's legacy, therefore, is something more profound than any single discovery or equation. He was the great connector, the intellectual catalyst, the architect of the invisible structures that guide modern scientific inquiry. He built the conceptual scaffolding that allowed other, more specialized minds to construct their towering achievements. He possessed a rare and powerful vision, the ability to stand back from the intricate details of a single field and see the overarching questions that unite all fields. He understood that the most important scientific work often begins with the art of asking the right question in the right way. His enduring contribution is woven into the very fabric of interdisciplinary research, into the systems thinking that now dominates our approach to biology, ecology, and social science, and into the language we use to speak about the most complex and fundamental challenges of our time. He was an administrator of ideas and a philosopher of inquiry, a figure who demonstrated that the greatest act of creation can sometimes be the elegant framing of a problem, providing the map that guides generations of explorers toward new worlds of understanding. We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.